Try it now. I think I put allow to record.
Okay, we're recording.
Awesome. Okay. So hello. Ooh, nope. Okay. Hello. So welcome to our event today. I'm Dylan, the Vice President of College Democrats, and we will be presenting and then having a discussion on Whitewashed, the civil rights movement. So before we begin, I'd like to allow our panelists and our moderator to introduce themselves, and then we can get started. So I'll pass it to Paula first.
Hi guys, my name is Paola. Thank you so much for coming. I'm the moderator today. I will pass it to Jalen.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Jalen, the Black Caucus Chair for the College Dems.
Hi guys, I'm Sophia. Thanks for coming. I am one of the chairs for the Hispanic Latino Caucus, and I'll pass it to my co-chair.
Hello, my name is Isabella. I am the co-chair of the Hispanic and Latinx Caucus, and yeah.
Awesome. So just so everybody is aware, we are going to be recording this event so that we can put it on our YouTube after, just so people, if they want to look at it later, can do so. And yeah, so we're going to get right into it. What was the civil rights movement? So for most people, obviously, with just what you're taught in school and everything like that, the civil rights movement was a concentrated campaign by African Americans and their allies to combat institutional racial discrimination, disenfranchisement, and racial segregation in the United States for the better half of the 20th century. So when we look at the civil rights movement specifically, it's a time period that most historians look at, not just the general movement itself, but a specific period of time where the efforts were very concentrated. So what we're going to be looking at is both the developments that led to it and then the actual movement itself. One key thing to emphasize is that this was a broad coalition of different groups of people. That you had, particularly in the South, a huge effort, obviously, by African Americans, both from the South and from across the United States. But you did also have allies in the Catholic Church, a lot of Jewish allies, LGBT allies, Hispanic allies, Asian American allies, etc. That it almost was, to kind of paraphrase the term that Jesse Jackson used, a rainbow coalition of people that came together to try to fight back. But at the end of the day, the people at the front lines were African Americans fighting, particularly in the South. But it's good to mention this was a nationwide event. And you'll see with some of the things that happened, just why it really was a nationwide thing and not just what comes to mind being Mississippi and South Carolina, etc. So the beginning of our journey goes from the foundations of the movement itself. So we kind of pin, at least in the 20th century, that with at the start being the founding of the NAACP. One of the most important figures of the NAACP's founding was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a very famous Black activist of the time, on top of other civil rights activists, both white and Black, that joined to create the NAACP. And their first major action was actually to boycott the film Birth of a Nation. That was a film that was actually played at the White House that was used specifically to romanticize the idea of the Ku Klux Klan. So they were able to boycott it across the United States. Two other events that happened prior to kind of the New Deal era was the Elaine massacre that led to the deaths of over 100 African Americans, and subsequent court hearings. This is something that was actually very important. It allowed for more court oversight over state criminal justice systems. So this kind of paved the way for future action from the courts to act on these kinds of issues. And then in 1930, one of the first efforts where you have two different groups coming together to work with one another was the NAACP and the American Federation of Labor, which would eventually become the largest labor union in the country. Successfully were able to reject the nomination of a person to the US Supreme Court, John J. Parker, who was both extremely anti-worker and extremely anti-African American. So then moving into World War II and beyond, which is a period that is not talked about as much, but is extremely important to the civil rights movement, was the first one being 1944, which was Smith v. Albright, that outlawed the usage of white primaries, particularly in the South. So eventually they were able to create alternative methods of disenfranchisement, but this was actually at the time one of the most important court victories of the time. One of the events that's actually not talked about, and you may not have heard about it before, but one that actually did spark the movement itself was in 1946, a World War II veteran named Isaac Woodard was brutally attacked a day after returning from the United States, and he was permanently blinded in the attack. That attack itself made national headlines and sparked nationwide outrage, which then led directly to Harry Truman desegregating the military in 1948. So that is a particular moment in the early civil rights movement history that's been glossed over a lot, but it is extremely important and kind of paved the way where a lot of men that went overseas to fight in World War II coming back realized they're fighting in Europe for the rights of Europeans, and they're coming back to a country where they don't even have rights. And that kind of spurred why you see, particularly in the civil rights movement, a lot of World War II veterans that are actually active participants in the movement. So then that kind of tops off with 1954, which is Brown v. Board of Education, that ruled that public schools can't be segregated, that Plessy versus Ferguson and separate but equal is not real. And that was a monumental case, but it's worth noting that most schools maintained segregation after that ruling, that it was not properly enforced by the federal government. So then moving into the actual movement itself materializing, the biggest and most prominent event that most people say sparked the modern movement was the death of Emmett Till in Mississippi. He was a young African-American that came down from Chicago and was murdered after being falsely accused of a crime that wasn't even a crime. And the subsequent open casket and very traumatic nature of his death sparked national outrage that led to the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Council and other organizations that began the actual, what we refer to as the civil rights movement. So the Montgomery bus boycott begins in 1955 with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat at the on a bus, and that would go on for over a year and would end in the bus services in Montgomery being desegregated. So that was the first major victory of the civil rights movement. That would then lead into 1957, which is the Little Rock Nine, when federal troops are sent to Arkansas to allow 9 students to enter an Arkansas school, which was the first real enforcement of Brown v. Board of Education. So another one that's not talked all that much about is the first Civil Rights Act of the 20th century, which was the Civil Rights Act of 1957. That paved the way for future Civil Rights Act by allowing federal prosecution for those who suppress the vote. The problem that you see, at least initially, is they don't actually use it at all, mostly out of a lack of political will to challenge the Southern base of the country. So then we enter the actual movement, and that it begins to gain momentum. Though some people might know about the Woolworth sit-ins, also known as the Greensboro sit-ins, and that was actually used as a prototype kind of trial run that was employed nationwide of similar sit-ins that actually were relatively successful with a lot of the companies that they did it to, because both a combination of the negative attention and just the reality of their very discriminatory policies started to backfire on them, especially in places outside of the South. So 1960 is also another interesting event where Ruby Bridges becomes the first African American child to desegregate an all-white school in Louisiana. She was, I believe, 9 years old at the time. It's also worth noting she is still alive, and she's, I think, around either 60 or 70 years old now. But that should put kind of into perspective the fact that this was not hundreds of years ago, that this was a very recent event. And she actually still currently speaks on tours and things like that about her experiences and subsequent activism. So 1961 is one of the more violent periods, and that was due to the usage of the Freedom Rides, which was a period where both African Americans and their allies would drive in buses down into the South and try to both desegregate those buses and desegregate the bus stops themselves. They were reacted with extreme violence by many of the people that were there, including multiple deaths. And I do believe there is an image of a bus that they set on fire when the Klan attacked one of them. So this was a very aggressive campaign by the civil rights movement, but it was successful in bringing more attention and outrage towards the actions of the South. 1961 is also a very interesting event that's called the Albany Campaign, which happened in Albany, Georgia. And it was an unsuccessful campaign led by MLK and other civil rights leaders, but most credit the failures of that campaign that would eventually allow them to hone their strategy and act more successfully in places like Birmingham and Selma later on. And then we kind of top it off in 1963 with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That concludes with MLK's I Have a Dream speech. Other notable speakers include Jesse Jackson and a bunch of both African-American leaders and labor leaders speaking at the same event, because the fight was both for civil rights and for better working wages and stronger unions. Even if you actually look at the picture, one of the signs says the UAW, which is the United Auto Workers. So that kind of showed that there was a coalition of different groups coming together in the same kind of intersectional pursuit of civil rights to benefit everybody involved. So then we kind of get to a period where the main priority is how do we secure the ballot box. That first kind of gets sparked with the 16th Street church bombing, which was a horrific event that killed multiple children. And the people who were responsible for it were not prosecuted until the 1990s. But that event in particular, similar to the Emmett Till situation, brought a lot of nationwide outrage that kind of gave the civil rights movement more momentum. That led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passing, which prevents employment discrimination on the basis of race, gender, religion, national origin, and color. It's also worth noting that in the actual text, gender is used as sex, and in a recent Supreme Court case last year, the Supreme Court did rule that sex included sexual identity and sexual preference. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is easily one of the most important, both at the time and today, pieces of legislation that we have that that's benefited a ton of different groups, particularly in the modern day with the inclusion of LGBT Q plus people within the confines of that. So then 1964 is also Freedom Summer, which was an event and campaign with the goal of registering African Americans to vote. While relatively unsuccessful, what it did lead to is a lot more political activism. Why it was unsuccessful, a couple factors, including people that were unwilling to want to do it out of fear of repercussions, on top of the fact that there was very aggressive intimidation, including the burning down of churches, these things that were created called freedom schools that were used to try to educate African Americans in rural areas. Those were burned down. It was a very coordinated campaign that was basically the actual term was for the quote unquote white resistance that I can't specifically remember right now, but there was a coordinated effort that's not talked about as much, that it wasn't just random bouts of racist reactions to these things, that a lot of it was coordinated and supported by the leaders in power, both on a religious side, political, social, etc., of these areas. 1965 is also the assassination of Malcolm X, which actually did have a very profound impact on the movement as a whole, and a profound impact on MLK himself. That would eventually lead later in 1965 to Bloody Sunday, which if you guys have never seen the movie Selma, I would definitely recommend it. Great movie, but encapsulates the events in Selma. But that event on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis and a bunch of other African-American demonstrators were brutally beaten on national television, and the subsequent march from Selma to Montgomery did result in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The final years are encapsulated by a shift in focus now that the ballot box has been secured and that the federal government can now enforce it. In 1966, the Black Panther Party is founded in Oakland, California, and they will continue past the 1960s. In 1966, the movement kind of refocuses on issues like fair housing and labor, on top of the continued pursuit of civil rights. 1967 is called the Long Hot Summer because you had nationwide riots and protests across the United States, mostly because of a lack of action post the Voting Rights Act to do anything in relation to civil rights, with most notable one being the Detroit riots of 1967. In 1968, MLK is assassinated in Tennessee, and the Civil Rights Act in 1968 is actually subsequently passed that bans housing discrimination. So generally, historians argue 1968 was the end of what we would call the quote unquote civil rights movement, but we continue to see obvious other actions that continue after. So before we move on to our panel, we have two small little sections also to just briefly mention, just because it'll both help the panel and just give a little bit more perspective. So the first one is, how does Florida factor in? Because to be honest, Florida purposely does not teach that much about its own civil rights history. And they do that because we have a terrible civil rights history. But if you ever in a public high school, etc., the curriculum mostly does not focus on any of the things that you might see here. Some of them you might be more familiar with, especially in recent years, because more attention has been brought to it, which is great, such as I can never remember how to pronounce it. Osaka, Paula, do you know how to pronounce it? I think it's Osawee massacre, which happened actually right in Central Florida, that led to the deaths of over 30 African Americans. Oh, someone has their hand up. Yes.
It's actually Ocoee.
Ocoee. Okay. Yeah. I'm not from Central Florida, so I don't know the name, but it was that one was a very significant event in Florida, on top of the Rosewood massacre that would happen 3 years later, that leads to the destruction of the city of Rosewood. It's also worth noting that something that Florida just doesn't address was that of all the states in the Deep South, Florida led in terms of per capita, the amount of lynchings that happened in the United States. That's something that's not talked about, and is again purposely not talked about. 1949 is the Groveland 4 case, where four young African-American men are accused of rape of a 17-year-old. It was unjustly accused, and then they were exonerated, but they were convicted by an all-white jury, and 3 of them were actually murdered. But then as recently as I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, they were officially pardoned by the state of Florida, because again, they did not commit that crime. 1951 is actually a very extremely important event, where Harry and Harriet Moore are assassinated in Sanford, which is obviously right near here. And they became the first NAACP officials assassinated in the civil rights movement. Harry T. Moore in particular was a leader in Florida on NAACP issues. And then in 1963, an extremely important campaign, known as the St. Augustine campaign, began, particularly because St. Johns County was actually regarded as one of the most racist counties in the entire United States. Yes, Sophia.
I do want to add, in case no one knew this, but if you guys know what Bright Futures is, it's the scholarship that Florida offers for a lot of in-state kids, and they actually, under the same program, they have the Rosewood Massacre Scholarship, and it's for descendants, family that was affected by it. So I just thought it's kind of sad that they don't teach this in school, but at least they offer, scholarships for the family that got affected by it. So I just thought that'd be cool to add.
No, yeah, and it is worth noting that if you look up when that bill was passed that created that, it was a very controversial issue, that a good chunk of the legislature voted against it, similar to how on the national level a significant number at the time of the 1980s of Republicans voted against the creation of MLK Day. That you see the same kind of thing happen where when we try to rectify at the very least, even though obviously we can't, but do the absolute bare minimum, there's still pushback and opposition. So all I'll just say with the St. Augustine movement is that it is credited particularly with serving as the catalyst for the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So Florida itself played a direct role in the passage of one of the most important pieces of legislation, sadly for a wrong reason, but it's also just worth mentioning that all of this stuff, unless you actually tried to look it up, is not taught in our public schools, and that's done by design. So the last thing before we get to our panel, just to kind of talk, since we are the Democratic Party, about how a specific event that the Democratic Party plays a direct role in, and that was the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party. So the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party was created in 1964 and was kind of entirely designed to challenge the Mississippi Democratic Party's whites only policy. So they were not allowed to have white primaries, but what they could do was effectively make their party a whites only party. This, particularly Mississippi, when over 30% of the population is African American, if not at the time even higher, excluded thousands upon thousands of people. So the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party was created by a bunch of activists in the wake of Freedom Summer to effectively challenge that at the upcoming Democratic National Convention in 1964. One of the most interesting videos that you can watch is the testimony that Fannie Lou Hamer in particular gave at the DNC, on top of others, making the case that they should be the delegates seated at the convention and not the Mississippi Democratic Party. It is documented that LBJ at the time purposely made a presidential address to get the cameras away from the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, and was relatively successful, but wasn't able to stop the general momentum being that they need to be seated. That eventually they were not, after multiple compromise attempts were made, they were not, and the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party actually at one point did sit in the seats where the Mississippi Democratic Party was supposed to, because the Mississippi Democratic Party had a tantrum and decided to leave the convention. But the Democratic Party still rejected them as delegates. The thing that did come out of this, though, was in 1968, the Democratic Party officially bans delegations being chosen through racial discrimination. So that would lead to, within future DNCs where they nominate the president and vice president, that if your state party was accused of using racial discrimination to determine the delegates, they would not be seated. So this was considered a major blow to the South's hold on the Democratic Party. And in a lot of ways, it gave the political cover for future Democratic candidates to not have to be extremely moderate and passive to the South like they had been under previous administrations, because they didn't have to rely on them as much for the nominating process. So with all that, I'm going to pass it over to Paola. I appreciate you guys listening to kind of just the general timeline to get yourself in the right area. And then, yeah, we have a lot of questions that I think we're very excited to hear what our panelists have to say. So I'll pass it to Paola. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dylan. That was very informative. So the first question I have is for everybody. And the question is, what do you feel are the most common misconceptions related to the civil rights movement? If you want, Jalen, you can start and then just popcorn it to the rest of the panel.
I mean, basically, I really just have like one main one. A lot of people kind of see, because this is one that bugs me a lot, is that a lot of people see the civil rights movement as just a racial rights movement, when it was really also a labor rights movement. Because a lot of people will call, which I know that this may be a question later, but a lot of people call a lot of people have been calling the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, kind of like a communist movement and stuff like that, because they advocate for certain more liberal policies toward like labor and like labor rights and all that other stuff. But and they kind of allude to the civil rights movement being more like, you know, just focused on racial rights. But I mean, when you look at it, it's really not the case because like MLK was advocating for socialist policies and was trying to advocate for more workers' rights and a bunch of other people. So I definitely feel that's definitely a misconception.
One that I have that Dylan touched on earlier is that people in like history classes, they teach you to think and they make you think that this was really so far away, but it really isn't. And I don't know if you guys know, but the pictures are not, a lot of pictures are like they do that on purpose, you know what I mean? And also Ruby Bridges is still alive, you know. It's just I just feel like a lot of people just think this was so far away, this was so long ago, but really it's not. And we're still fighting for certain rights till this day. So I feel like that's really important to note.
I think one really common misconception is that, especially with the way it's taught in schools, people tend to think that it's just like a one and done thing. You know, it started in the 50s, ended with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's it. We're done. We're over. We did our job. Like, I feel like that is one of the biggest misconceptions because I feel like it does a really big disservice to the issues that still impact the Black community to this day.
Yeah, those were all really good points. Okay, so the next question I have is just for Jalen. The question is, do you feel the civil rights movement era has been used to justify criticism of modern day efforts at seeking racial justice? And do the people who make this connection have a fundamental lack of understanding of the civil rights movement itself?
Yeah, I definitely feel that people use it, as you know, I kind of alluded to earlier. I definitely feel that that people use the civil rights movement to kind of criticize modern movements. You know, a lot of people going on of what other panelists said, they feel that civil rights movement was like, you know, during slavery times and stuff like that. Like it was like something that happened like hundreds of years ago. And because of that, you know, people have forgot what made the civil rights movement great. You know, it was peaceful, it was this, it was that, and a lot of people act like they don't remember the fact that there was like sit-ins and that there was different amounts of like violence against protesters, and there was a lot of pushback. And that at the time, the civil rights movement really wasn't that popular until, like, you know, as time progressed and people kind of we kind of get out of that time that people are like, well, you know, I was always for the civil rights movement. So a lot of people kind of use that to, as I said earlier, like degrade BLM because BLM has been criticized for being too aggressive, if not oftentimes violent. But it's like, you know, a lot of times with protests, that tends to happen. People aren't going to protest, you know, happily. They're protesting because they're feeling that their rights are violated. So they're going to be angry. And as the civil rights movement shows us, is that that's just commonplace. So people definitely use that. You know, not to name drop anybody, but like somebody like Candace Owens uses what do you call it? Uses the civil rights movement as a crutch for a lot of her arguments. You know, saying that BLM doesn't adhere to the civil rights movement. They're just a radical movement. They're not trying to advocate for civil rights. They're just completely out there, and they cite the civil rights movement. But as I said earlier, the civil rights movement was all about getting in people's faces, into their spaces, and trying to advocate for your rights. So I definitely feel that people use that in a very dishonest way.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely gets used for bad justification. All right, so this other question I have is for everybody. The question is, how important do you feel intersectionality is in the fight for racial justice? Sophia, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. I think it's so important. I think we really just need to stick together, I guess, in simple terms. Like, for example, I don't know if you guys have seen, but everything coming out of the Asian American community attacks lately have just been so terrible to read, but it's good to know about Hispanic people, like the ICE, immigration, and then Black Lives Matter, of course, during the summer where it really was popular. And I think it's so important to know that kind of everything stems from kind of just hatred. So even though we're all different groups, we're kind of being attacked, I guess. Even though we're all different groups, it all stems from the same thing of people just, not just being racist and being discriminatory towards us. So I think it's very important to recognize that and also stick together because, we all have to work together and, fight for our rights and all that.
Yeah, agree. Intersectionality is really, really important when talking about racial justice because people's identities don't exist in a vacuum. People can have multiple identities that have issues that affect each of those identities that compound onto each other. So people that are like trans Black women or LGBTQ Black people are extremely, extremely excluded sometimes when people talk about racial justice. This can kind of be seen like in, if you've ever like seen jokes about like millennial girl boss feminism, how like it's very much whitewashed feminism, that it doesn't extend to people in the LGBTQ plus community, trans women, queer women, women of color. And I think that is an issue that has to do with intersectionality because it's not being extended to everybody in that community. And so when we talk about racial justice, even within one group, Black people, Latinx people, Asian people, that we need to consider everybody and how their identities affect their particular experiences with prejudice and racism and sexism and all this, BS. And I think that we need to make sure that we aren't leaving those people out because everybody deserves to be treated equally, and we need to make sure that we are considering everybody's needs.
Yeah, definitely intersectionality is very important because a lot of people kind of they don't factor it in a lot of times when they're looking at certain problems. Like when you're looking at an issue like workers' compensation, like labor, again going back to like labor, like if you're looking at the wage gap and different issues like that, you may see like which I don't have the actual numbers, but you'd see that people of color might make less than like white people. But then when you factor in the fact that this person of color is a woman, they might make even less. And then you tack it on and you tack it on and you tack it on. So it's definitely important to consider intersectionality.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. So another question that I have for everybody is, do you feel that there are parallels between the civil rights movement and modern efforts at racial justice? Isabella, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So I think that there are some similarities because, of course, they have the same platform, which is, facing racial disparity and prejudice. But I think that there are certain similarities that lie specifically in the ways that people are protesting. And as Sophia mentioned before, like it's really not that common that people, or I'm not sorry, Jalen mentioned before that people don't really see that the civil rights movement isn't this just like perfectly pristine movement that was like 100% peaceful, and that people really wanted to demonize people that were leaders of the civil rights movement and all this, all of that. And I think that is something that's really similar between modern day racial justice movements and civil rights movements, because they are both almost scapegoats. Because I'm sure you've heard, like, when the Black Lives Matter movements were really, really big this summer, like all of the protests, everyone's like, how is it okay that Black Lives Matter can go and riot and create, all this destruction, but like nobody mentions anything about like that with the Capitol, that these groups are being marginalized and demonized because all they want to do is fight for equality.
Kind of going off what Isabel said, another parallel that I see is that everything's met with violence except for what happened in the Capitol. So like they used back then you see the what Dylan said, the movie Selma, was it? I think they made us watch that in like middle school. I think I don't know if anyone else had to, but they would show how everyone got beat up by the police, and they would use like water and gas and all that, and you would think it would stop, that people would be more like it's just protesting, you know what I mean? But we're still being met by violence, everything happening when you see people get hurt, all these things. So that's definitely something that I see.
I would definitely say that a parallel between the civil rights movement and modern efforts for civil rights justice and just equality in general is that which it's kind of disappointing to see, is that there is a urge by a lot of people, and I guess I'd just say that the establishment, to just basically ignore like a lot of people's troubles that they're going through. Like if you look at the civil rights movement, a lot of people are like, well, it's not that bad. It's separate, but it's equal. And but today it's not that, but it's instead it's well, statistically Black people aren't really shot more than white people. And if you really look at the statistics and the statistics and the statistics, kind of manipulating numbers and degrading people's causes for trying to strive for civil rights, it's definitely a problem that occurs today. And sadly, it's what I believe definitely correlates the two movements.
Yeah, of course. And Jalen, I have another question for you. Do you feel that certain elements and people of the civil rights movement, such as Black Panther, the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X, are unfairly criticized and mischaracterized in the modern day?
I mean, I would definitely say yes, because a lot of times people will try to kind of look at the worst things that they've done and try to use that as a validation for why they should not try to push forward civil rights. I mean, everybody has their own way of going about certain things, and if you look at, which I don't condone violence, but if you look at certain situations that they were put into, it definitely makes you think about the options that they have.
Right. Yeah. Um, okay, so the next question that I have is for everybody. And it's, what are some ways we can improve education around the events of the civil rights movement and how it is taught to students? Sophia, do you want to start?
Sure. So obviously the ideal way would be starting, in an elementary school, where everything starts, teach us the truth about everything and try not to sugarcoat it so much. But, you can only do so much, right? So I think, start early. So I think that with social media being so important nowadays, and, a lot of people are on it, I think it's very useful for people, kind of like what you guys are doing, what we are doing in DemsUCF every day of Black History Month, someone new. I think it's important to start like that because a lot of people, even if school didn't teach them, sometimes you grow up in a household where you're not taught that either. You know what I mean? You grow up and you're raised closed-minded. So I think that through social media, we could really reach out to more people and educate them around it. But obviously, it'd be very nice to start, teaching some elementary school, because I remember learning about civil rights movement, but it was just like, oh, they marched for their rights and then they got it. But obviously, it's not like that. So I think, again, social media will really help to reach more people.
I think that like I mentioned before, a lot of what the American school system tries to push is this packaged, pretty version of the civil rights movement, right? And I think that they really need to, start early. 100%, I agree. But and also I think be honest about what these people had to endure to simply get the right to be alive in America. And I think that to not necessarily, I feel like it's kind of a delicate balance, especially with young kids when you have to teach them about like violence and everything. But especially when you get older in high school, I feel like there needs to be more. If any of you guys took a push AP US history or even regular US history, you know that there's a lot of time dedicated to everything. But the civil rights movement is honestly usually just one unit of the teaching, which I think does a huge disservice to the civil rights movement because there is so much history interwoven with, this country, and we need to examine it from the start of where these issues lie. We had to examine the seeds and then see how it progresses throughout history and be really honest about what the civil rights movement was, with the kind of people that were involved, the kind of stuff that they had to endure just to be alive.
I mean, I would say, adopt the 1619 project, kind of, try to find a way to work it into your curriculum, not try to take up the 1776 project, because that's how we got into this place, in terms of education. Having to, keep feeling that, having this urge to kind of make everything seem prettier than it actually was, trying to make everything patriotic and kind of tamp down the stuff that maybe wasn't so patriotic. A lot of the ugliness. So I mean, definitely I agree with the other panelists. We need to be more practical, more honest, and we need to definitely strive to do better, especially in our public schools, in regards to stop, as this panel is called, to stop whitewashing, and in our schools. That's basically it. There's nothing more to no better way to put it.
Yeah, I can agree that everything is sold to us like it was a fairy tale. The next question I have is just for Jalen. The Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party was one of the most successful historic instances of African Americans and their allies impacting internal Democratic Party policy. Do you believe that the modern Democratic Party still needs significant reform in relation to how it treats minority voters and increases representation?
I'd say definitely. There's even though the Democratic Party is, out of our two parties, the most diverse party, there's always room for improvement for either party. You never stop trying to improve diversity. It's a constant it's it's a constant uh action that you have to continuously take. It's a process. It's not something that stops once we have a female a diverse female vice president, or we have our first black president. It's a process that continuously moves forward. So I definitely say definitely.
Yeah, I agree. We can definitely work as a party more the way, Stacey Abrams did make that national. Okay, I have another question. This one is for everybody. What are areas and issues that Hispanic Americans and African Americans can work together on to promote, advocate, and rally around within the Democratic Party? Isabella, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think currently one of the biggest issues that we need to advocate for are definitely the way that COVID-19 is affecting the Black and Hispanic communities. This is something that I think is very pertinent, and I think it shows not only the wealth gap between people that are people of color and white people, but also the way that healthcare is sort of structured to. If you've ever seen that quote, healthcare to a Black woman is like the police to a Black man. Like, a lot of times Black people are not validated or believed in healthcare if they can get it at all. And I think that it's something that needs to be worked on now because it is not something that is going to wait for us to sort of discuss. It's something that is happening now and needs to be solved. I think also another really important thing that we need to be discussing and talking about is the school to prison pipeline and how it disproportionately affects especially Black children and Black children with disabilities. That is something that is, I think, very pertinent. The way that children, especially Black children, are I think 3 times more likely to be sent to the office for something that is much more objective, like disrespect or rudeness, as opposed to white kids who would be sent to the office for more concrete things like vandalism, smoking, what have you. So I think that's something that's really important too.
It's almost like Isabella and I have the same mind, because I was going to say the same things. But for a class last semester, I had to do an article, and it's very true what she says about COVID, about how Black and Hispanic communities are being way more impacted by it. It's really sad, really, because, the neighborhoods are not that great, and the hospitals are being, packed. So I work at Publix, so right now we're doing the vaccine. So I hope that, everything gets better for all the communities, especially the Black and Hispanic one. I also, when I was a freshman in high school, I did a debate on the school prison pipeline, and I wish I had my debate notes here with me, but what she said is also very true about how minority kids are more likely to be searched and all of that, which we need to stop. And and then something I want to add, an area I want to add, was gerrymandering. And I guess maybe not just gerrymandering, but how we vote and everything. A lot of times minority communities don't have the access or information to do the voting correctly, because you have to register first, and then you have to actually get to the polling place. So I think that's an area that both the African Americans and Hispanic Americans can work on together, and hopefully it gets better in the future, because we need to vote. Voting is our voice, and for things to get better for communities, I think that's very important.
I basically agree with everything our other panelists have said. If I had to pick one thing in particular, I would definitely say that focusing on our schools would definitely be the best one, because a lot of people are kind of how come we haven't opened up the schools yet? How come we don't have our kids in school? Doing school over Zoom is torture. It's not easy. It's hard on parents. But what a lot of people fail to realize is that a lot of communities, especially those of Hispanic and uh people of color, just people of color in general, their schools, which are funded by property taxes, are not in the best of shape. They don't have full good AC unit, if they don't have the necessary precautions and or amenities that you would need to have in-person school during a pandemic, that other schools may be able to. So I definitely say that focusing on making sure our schools are better funded and dealing with that, and offering better school programs, starting with schools are definitely the best way to go.
Yeah, definitely educational equity would be a great step in the right direction. And I also liked what Isabella, what you said about healthcare, because Black and Hispanic women, or Black women especially, but Black and Hispanic women are constantly undermined, um, especially when it comes to like giving birth and that kind of thing. All right, well, that is all the pre-written questions that we have. So I want to open the floor to anybody. Does anybody have any questions that you would like to ask your panel? You could either raise your hand or type it in the chat box and I'll read it out loud. Okay, well, I have a question. The question that I have for the panel, all of you can answer, is when was like your moment that you were like, yeah, I have to join the fight. I can't just sit silent. Like, what was your breaking point, or what was like the accumulation that made you, step over the edge?
I guess I could go first. I have two, being a woman and being Hispanic. First, being a woman, in elementary school, it really bugged me when all the boys said that I couldn't play with them or run with them because I was a girl and I couldn't run as fast or anything. So from very young, I was like a feminist. I was like, wait a minute, what is this? Like, I can do all that. So being a woman, that's when really, and ever since, I'm just very competitive. So then, anyway, so that was about being a woman. Being Hispanic, I haven't so much have felt anything to my face. I don't want being racist to me, but my parents have, and I've seen it happen. Uh, I'm able to speak English pretty well without an accent, but both my parents have strong accents. And one time my mom was speaking Spanish to a friend in Barnes and Nobles, and this lady just got so mad. I know you guys probably know about like when people are like, we're in America, speak English. And this lady started just chasing my mom and her friend because they're speaking Spanish, saying that how dare you speak Spanish if we're in America. And when she came home and told me that story, I was like, that's just so messed up, you know what I mean? So I think from that. And then another time my parents were doing a road trip. This was like in the 90s. So maybe hopefully times have changed, but they wanted to go inside like a small shop to use the restroom, and they wouldn't let them because they're Hispanic. That actually happened to them. So I don't think I have faced anything. I mean, I've been called Dora, because I'm Hispanic. They're like, oh, you speak Spanish and all that. But all these instances really made me think like this needs to change.
I think for me, I feel like I look more outwardly Asian than I do Hispanic. You could probably tell by my last name. I'm half Chinese and I'm half Cuban, but I feel like I look a little more Asian, and my last name kind of gives people the impression, that I am Asian. And I think that for me, when I was a kid, it was a lot of like very casual racism, like a lot of like weird comments about like people would pull their eyes back, a lot of weird like, can you do my math homework for me kind of stuff. Very much like kind of under the stuff that people would let fly. So I was like, I didn't really understand it when I was a kid. And now that I'm older, I look back and I'm like, damn, that kind of sucked. But when I was a kid, I didn't really get it. And I think another thing that really kind of pushed me to that was kind of growing up, and I feel like I was lucky enough to have some really, really great teachers that kind of prioritize, especially in my history classes, giving a non-Eurocentric view of how the world works and the reasons why things happen the way they did. And so, like I said, I'm super, super grateful for that. And I think that getting that kind of education really, you know, not to rag on anybody, but I feel like if you get a good education, being a liberal is kind of inevitable. But I like I said, I'm very grateful for that education, and I think that is really something that kind of encouraged me to use my voice and be involved in things that affect me, but not only me, people that I know, people that I love, that are a part of these communities that are marginalized.
For me, I'd say it'd probably be three things. So, obviously I'm black. So, one of the things that well, two things on that. Um, the first was seeing Barack Obama become president and seeing what he had to go through. A lot of it not because of policy, but because he was black. You saw a lot of backlash on that. So that definitely woke me up to a lot of those issues and kind of brought me into the fight. Along with second thing with me is just as people on the panel have mentioned, just microaggressions, a lot of microaggressions. Being younger, I don't want to get into like specifics, but a lot of microaggressions. Second thing is kind of like economic status. For me, and I'm pretty sure for a lot of people, 2016 was a hard year. Uh, but for me, especially economically. So going through that definitely awoke in my gave me awareness to a lot of economic problems, and kind of brought me into that fight, along with not just like the social justice fight. So definitely those two things. And then the third thing is I know people who are in the LGBTQ camp, that group, being knowing people and then seeing what they have gone through, because that's happens for a lot of people. We don't really notice stuff until we are in contact with people who are going through those things, if we're not going through them ourselves. So seeing people use, like, especially in Florida, like a lot of people, and I don't know if this is the South in general, using like oh, that's gay, or using gay as a slur, and seeing how how cringy that is, and like how that has affected people. I definitely say those three things have brought me into this fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think microaggressions and racism will push anybody to the left. Okay, so does anybody else have any questions? All right, for the panelists, do you guys have anything else you would like to say? Okay, well, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Jalen, Sophia, and Isabella. Thank you, Dylan, for the presentation, and thank you guys all for coming. Happy Black History Month.
Thank you for having us. Bye.